Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Psychosocial Safety and Wellbeing. My name is Nicole Walker, and I'm the Senior Alumni Engagement Manager here at Griffith University. It's my pleasure to be your host today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Today's session is being recorded and a stenographer is providing live captions. To access these, please click on the link posted in the chat. Today's topic is one that's really important to so many of you, myself included, and I can see we've had great registrations and great attendance joining us here online right now. So welcome to you all, and really glad that you've made the time to be here and hear from Claire today. We're going to move into the presentation quickly, so we've got as much time as possible at the end for Q&A. Given the potential sensitivity of some of the topics, please ensure you draft your questions in a way that maintains the confidentiality of all parties. Questions will be moderated today with those deemed to have the widest potential for all to benefit prioritised. So now on to our speaker. Claire started her career as an occupational therapist almost 15 years ago and has worked across many industries supporting individuals and communities with their different needs. After experiencing a significant period of burnout, Claire turned her focus specifically to psychosocial safety and wellbeing, knowing she wanted to do all she could to make all organisations as safe as possible for people's mental and emotional health. What a great personal and professional goal to have. I just love reading that every time. For Claire, as the Senior Specialist for Wellbeing at Griffith University, she is driven to create environments where people can thrive and flourish. And she's here today to share her knowledge with you all. Claire, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to hand the screen now over to you so we can hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, for that great welcome. It's always interesting to hear your career journey and is summarised in 2 paragraphs, but it's an absolute pleasure to be with everyone today. Thank you so much, as Nicole said, for registering and jumping on, or if you're watching the recording at a later date, thanks for engaging in this space. I'm going to share my screen as usual with our lovely technological world. It's always, hopefully that's worked. But as Nicole said, my name's Claire, and this journey for me has been a long and interesting one. And as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to be sharing some knowledge with you today. It was really interesting. I always do this when I'm asked to speak on this topic. There's so many things to talk about, and I provided Nicole with some outcomes, and then I had a look at them and went, I don't know how I'm going to do all of this in 35 minutes, but we're going to do the speed dating version. And so this presentation today is really to give you an overview of where psychosocial risk and psychosocial safety has come from, some of the key points in that space, because it's a new and emerging area. And interestingly, across industries, there's lots of discussion of how do we make this work? You know, how do we approach this in a way that is great for our people, but also, manageable for our organisation. And we really wanted to share some practical about what we've done at Griffith. Griffith University has the pleasure and exceptional status to be not only producing amazing research in this space that goes outward into industry, but we're also a large business. We employ over 4,000 regular permanent staff, and then academic sessionals and casuals on top of that. So it's a really large, complex organisation, and tackling this as an organisation has been a journey as well. So hopefully you can walk away with some practical tips on what's worked for us and where we're going. I wanted to start here, and I always start in this space talking about the why. Why is psychosocial safety so important? Why are we putting so much emphasis on this? And I start talking about stress and mental health more broadly. Often we think of mental health as we've either got it or we don't got it. There's either good mental health or there's poor mental health. And it's really important to acknowledge that mental health is actually a really broad spectrum. And it's really something that moves and changes for each individual over time. And it can be something that is changing on a daily basis, or something that might change over time as well. lots and lots of things can influence where someone might sit on this mental health continuum. And there's lots of different versions of this mental health continuum. If you haven't seen it before, it's a great one to Google and just get your head around the idea that we've got one end of the spectrum, which is where we're, really healthy. Some people describe this as in being in the flow state. Often when we're in this really healthy end of the spectrum, we're really innovative, we're, feel like we're hitting all of those goals in our life, whether professionally or personally. And then we've got the other end of the spectrum where people may be ill, so they might be suffering a mental health illness, or they might sustain a psychological injury. And that's where people are going to need significant amount of supports. There's going to be impact on their world, professionally and personally again. And what we're seeing is there's so many influences for people that can move them up and down the spectrum. One of the important things to acknowledge is that work can influence someone's movement up and down the spectrum of mental health and what their experience of mental health is. And so when we start talking about psychosocial safety, it's important to acknowledge that this is the big why. We want to create psychosocial safety in our organizations because we want to have a positive influence on someone's mental health. And we want to be able to confidently say that our organization is doing everything possible to keep someone and influence someone to be up that healthy end of the spectrum. When we talk about psychosocial safety, it's one of those terms, unfortunately in this space, for whatever reason, there's lots and lots of terms that are very, very similar. We talk about psychological safety, which is a very different concept, but fits under the umbrella of psychosocial safety. But psychosocial safety focuses on identifying and removing or minimizing any psychosocial hazards that are present in a workplace or a working environment. So those are those hazards that have the potential to cause harm to an individual's psychological or mental health. It's really important when we start talking about psychosocial hazards that we have a really good understanding of how a hazard interacts with psychosocial risk and then what they're operating towards in terms of psychosocial safety. So that hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm. The risk is how likely that harm is actually going to happen. And then psychosocial safety is what we're aiming for, that goal of creating psychosocially safe workplaces for people to walk through. It's been a really interesting journey, as I said, in the literature around psychosocial safety and where this has emerged from. Interestingly enough, psychological safety has, the psychological health and wellbeing has been included in Queensland's workplace health and safety legislations since 2011. So all workplaces had an obligation to look after not only the physical health of their employees, but their psychological health as well. What started to emerge was businesses across industries were doing the physical safety better and getting pretty consistently good at looking out for the physical safety of their employees, but we weren't necessarily looking out for the psychological health as well. And so in Queensland, in 2023, we introduced, 2022, we introduced a new code of practice or a legislative body, a legislative instrument that looked more specifically at psychosocial hazards and that impact on psychological health. Now, I'm acknowledging that Griffith alumni come from all parts of Australia and also internationally. Interestingly, there's consistency, but not the same approach to psychosocial safety across jurisdictions in Australia. I'm based in Queensland, so I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the psychosocial legislation in Queensland and what that looks like, but really encouraging everyone to get online and have a look at what the differences are in their legislative jurisdiction. Interestingly, when we start talking about the specific hazards that are present in the legislation, every state and jurisdiction is slightly different. And when we get to that bit, I'll call out some of the new additions that the Commonwealth legislation has just put in place as well. So this code of practice and the code of practices around Australia wanted to provide more guidance and a better framework for businesses and organisations in managing those psychosocial hazards. It calls out the way that businesses should approach these and also the duties of all of the different people within businesses. Now, wanting to call out here, one of the interesting things in this code of practice is that like every other legislative piece of instrument that we have, it also calls out the responsibility of workers in this space. So I think often we get into conversations where either safety teams or HR teams that are looking at psychosocial safety are looking just primarily at what's happening within the organisation. But there's also very clearly an individual responsibility that this code of practice talks about in terms of people and workers being able to look out for their own psychological health and well-being and not doing things that are going to impact on that, but also not having a negative influence on any other workers' psychological health and well-being. So it's a really interesting conversation when we get stuck into different hazards like bullying and harassment, where at an individual level, workers are also breaching legislation if they are going out into a workplace and negatively impacting on another worker's psychological health. So just a really interesting call out there. From an international perspective, there's also now an international standard, so ISO 45003. Anyone who's joining that's sitting in the safety space probably would know ISO 45001, which is the safety management system standard broadly. 45003 is guidelines for managing psychosocial risks. So what we're seeing internationally is more focus and more conversation about how we do this in business and how we make sure that, again, we're protecting that psychological health for all workers across all industries. I love this diagram. If you know an occupational therapist, you'll know that we're really big on diagrams. We love a good visual. This is pulled directly out of the Queensland Code of Practice, but the reason that I really like this diagram is I think it highlights really well what we're trying to do in this space. So the diagram from left to right reads that we've got psychosocial hazards arising from 3 different elements. We've got psychosocial hazards that arise from work design, so how a person interacts with the way that their work is designed and set up. We've got hazards arising from the work environment, so how a person interacts with the physical environment, but this also talks about the organisational environment, so work culture, transparency of policies and procedures and processes. Change management sits in that work environment piece as well, which is a really interesting differentiation from just thinking about the physical environment. And we also have workplace interaction, so how a person interacts with other people in their workplace and how that might negatively impact their psychological health. So if we're a person and we're interacting with one of those hazards, it causes a stress response. Now, again, interestingly, stress responses in human beings are very natural and often can be used as a motivator. There's lots of research out there around stress and how there's a healthy level of stress and then an unhealthy level of stress. But what we know is that stress response is frequent. So if it happens regularly, either on a daily basis or at regular intervals within a day, if it's prolonged, so it happens over a really significant period of time, or if it's severe, that stress response can lead to physical harm. Often that might be with one study talking about musculoskeletal injury, particularly around necks and shoulders. Lots of people have that description of where they hold their stress, and also psychological harm. So this might be an instance of a psychological injury or feelings of depression, anxiety, lots of significant things that can come from that prolonged, frequent or severe stress response. It's really interesting to note that when we talk about physical harm here, also we're talking about where psychosocial hazards can interact and cause a physical incident. So if someone's working working at a high job demand level, they're doing something really quickly and there's a rush to do it, they're more likely to engage in an incident or have an accident and sustain physical harm. So the really interesting piece around psychosocial hazards is not only how they can impact on that psychological mental health, but how they're impacting within the physical safety of your environments as well. There's lots of conversations happening in our space at Griffith in terms of upskilling our safety partners to recognise where psychosocial hazards might have had an influence or an impact on a physical incident that's happened, where previously we may not have asked those questions, or that might not have formed a significant portion of the safety investigation. So wrapped up in this is where we see the process of how psychosocial hazards can cause that harm. often as people leaders on the ground or as workers, we might just see that right-hand side of it. Someone who has experienced the harm or is going through that exposure to a psychosocial hazard. So we might hear things like, oh, I'm just so burnt out. I don't know how I'm going to cope with this anymore. Or I'm really disengaged. You know, I cannot find the motivation to engage in this work anymore. Or we might see more accidents or mistakes being made. What we want to do from a psychosocial safety perspective and from an education perspective with this risk management approach is move our focus back towards the left. So we're really dealing with the proactive, preventative work that's going to decrease the exposure to these hazards in the first place. We want to reduce that harm or that level of harm as much as possible. So that's why I love this diagram, because it really clearly visually sets out for people. And when I've been doing people leader training and education in our space, this is something that the people leaders really connect to, because they understand where I'm coming from when we start talking about risk management and the impact it can have. Because often people leaders, particularly at the coalface, are talking to me and they're saying, I don't know how to approach this. You know, I want to support my people. I want to do the best by them. I'm seeing these things, I'm hearing these things, but I don't know how to approach it. And so this approach and talking about psychosocial safety and risk management gives them some really clear steps and really clear actions to be able to take back into their teams, which what we're finding is creating that practical step by step. This is how you can own this. This is how you can take, you know, a confidence in going back to your team and addressing this. When we're talking about those psychosocial hazards, as I said, these ones are pulled from the Queensland Code of Practice, and I've touched on a couple, and look, I could spend all day talking about each one of these and the nuance of each one of these, but we're not going to do that today. I'm not going to disappear down that rabbit hole. I've got Nicole in the background, and I know she'll start making gestures, waving me down if I get too caught up. But what we were talking about before is we're talking about those hazards that come from interactions with the working environment. So that can be poor environmental conditions. So physical conditions. Is someone working out in the Queensland summer for 10 hours a day, and that has an impact on their psychological health? You know, are they working in the rain for 10 hours a day? You know, if you're based in Southeast Queensland, I would love to see the sun for more than one day at the moment, but I couldn't imagine working out in the rain and being damp for a period of time. Would definitely have an impact on my mental health and where I sat on that continuum. We're talking about remote or isolated work. Now, this is a really interesting one when we get into the discussions about hybrid work, remote working setups, and how that impacts on people, and how we find a really good balance of what works for people psychologically and then what works for businesses and engagement, and making sure that they have that human connection, because human beings, we actually seek connection. We want to be connected to other people. So if we're working from home 100% of the time, how as an organization are we encouraging and collaborating and building that connection? But also isolation in terms of lone workers. That could be lone workers because they're isolated geographically, or you might be someone that you know, starts early or works late. And if you're the lone worker, how are we protecting your psychological health being in a space by yourself? Organizational justice, that's that transparency piece. Do we have consistent procedures and policies across our organization? And as one person, can I expect to move through those processes equitably to a person that's sitting next to me? And poor change management, another really big hot topic for a lot of organizations at the moment, around how do we do change management well, but acknowledging when change is either too frequent, not managed well, there's not good consultation. That can have a really significant impact on the workers in that environment and increase exposure to harm because of that. We've got that work design piece, so how someone interacts with how their work is set up. And what types of work they're doing. Traumatic events or material. Interestingly, this is talking about direct, but also vicarious trauma as well. So, for example, we have an institute at Griffith called the Griffith Criminology Institute, where we have really passionate academics and staff who are looking at vulnerable populations and really traumatic pointy end. I want to describe them, situations, and putting research into that as to how we can create better outcomes. But how do we make sure that their passion and their exposure and their work in that space is not significantly impacting their own psychological health is a lot of the discussions that I'm having at the moment in the back end when I'm, not talking to lots of alumni. And there's really interesting conversations in that space. We also talk about our first responders when we talk about traumatic events as well. Job demands, this is a really interesting one and another hot topic. This can be physical demands, so demands on your physical body. You think of your construction, chippies, plumbers, all of our people that keep our societies and communities running and keep infrastructure running. There's really high physical demands of those jobs, and what is it impacting psychologically to have that impact on your body? But also job demands can be cognitive and emotional. And often that's feeling like I've got so much work that I cannot physically get it done in the amount of time that I have to do it. So lots and lots of conversations here about how do we manage job demands, and in a financially tight economy, how do we manage job demands where there might not be budget or resources to increase the staff that we've got in an organisation? So there's lots of conversations about different levers we can pull and different controls, and we're going to get into that about where we work in this space. Low role clarity, do I know what I'm doing? And do other people know what I'm doing? Low job control, do I have control over how I do my work and where I do my work? Reward and recognition. Now, this one I will stop because one of my favorite pieces of research, and I am that person who reads all the research that sits behind the assessments in this piece, was that reward and recognition, and this is pulled from the People at Work research paper, so the big paper that sat behind the People at Work risk assessment, was that low reward and recognition is not as much of a spectrum as we initially thought it was. I think often we can think, okay, if I'm giving reward and recognition, that's a nice to have. But if I'm not saying anything, and if I'm not talking poorly about someone, but I'm not going out of my way to recognize them, then that's kind of like a neutral middle ground. And what the People at Work survey and evidence showed is that there's actually no neutral middle ground. And people perceive that silence or the lack of recognition and reward as actually like a negative. So if I'm not receiving that recognition from my boss or my people leader, I start to think, am I doing something wrong? Have I put them offside? And I start to get into that potentially negative thought spiral, and it has a negative impact on psychological health. So one of the things, and one of the easy takeaways, if you take away one thing today, is that a pat on the back or that recognition goes a long way, and is something really easy that we can do as people leaders across organizations. We want to be seen when we come to work. We want to be seen for the fact that I rolled out of bed this morning at 6:15 and I am here and I'm giving it my all, and I want to be valued for that. So it's a really interesting one in terms of making sure that you are working into that space. And then we've got our people-to-people interactions. These are some there that have significant consequences. We're talking violence and aggression in the workplace, potentially from members of the public or external stakeholders, but also internally in organisation. Bullying, harassment, including sexual harassment, and then poor support. Now, poor support can be interpersonal support, but it can also be, do I have the material, equipment, training that I need to do my job, and that I can be successful in my role? And the one that I missed there that I want to come back to, which is really interesting, is poor relationships, including conflict. Now, I think, again, often we think in organizations at work, we might, have tension or, not get along with someone. But if it's not, extreme, potentially sometimes it gets normalized. Yeah, you're not going to get along with everyone in the workplace. But recognizing that kind of starting place of having poor relationships, including conflict, can often escalate into situations where there might be bullying or there might be harassment, or we might get into spaces where someone has experienced psychological harm from that conflict. So it's all ends of the spectrum there, and really important to acknowledge that we're working in all of that space. Now, just calling out again what I mentioned before around, creating a process for people leaders to be able to follow. Often psychosocial safety, when you kind of start talking about it, and even when we start naming hazards, it feels really big. It's like, oh my goodness, how do I tackle this? There's so many components of that. There's so many different influencing factors into all of those hazards and how they interact and how they accumulate. And I always reassure people that this isn't a start-stop journey. It's not linear. Unfortunately, I don't get to a certain point at Griffith where I get to, put my hat on my head and say I'm retiring because I have fixed psychosocial safety. It's a really ongoing journey. The reason why that's exciting is we keep getting to get better. We keep getting to ask those questions and revisit the ideas of, hey, is what we're doing working? Could we do it better in this space? Has something changed so we need to approach this differently? And that's why I love the fact that risk management has 4 really clear steps and it's cyclical. So that idea being that once you get to step 4, we're just going to start at step 1 again, and we get that chance to keep having those conversations. If you've not seen a risk management approach before, there's lots of different versions out there. This is from, again, that Queensland Code of Practice. It talks about consultation. So how are we talking with our people? How are we making sure that all stakeholders around our organisation are involved and have voice? It talks about management commitment. So a lot of what we're talking about in this psychosocial space means that we need commitment from our senior leaders, from our executive, even from our people leaders at a local level, because they're going to be the ones supporting the implementation and the effectiveness of these controls. And so then we follow these steps. Number 1, we identify the hazards. So we've provided that slide before, but different organisations will have different hazards and different ways that those hazards might present. When I start talking about what we did at Griffith, we did the People at Work survey back in April of 2023. When we got the results for that, we then did a whole bunch of focus groups across the course of a 9-month period. And what we discovered was those hazards might be the same, but the reasons those hazards and the exposure to those hazards were happening were different for different groups of people and different cohorts. So it was so important to get out and talk to people about how these hazards are impacting them, what the exposure looks like, and what's influencing the exposure to those hazards, because that then guided the controls that we put in place for different parts of our organisation. Whereas if we'd just gone, okay, high job demands is present for, 95% of the university, we're going to do X, Y, and Z and make it the same across the board. That wouldn't have had the impact that we needed it to have because of those nuances and those, different unique experiences. And look, universities, again, we're a really interesting organisation. We don't do the same thing. I have the pleasure of helping our dental clinic, which is one of the biggest dental clinics in Southeast Queensland on the Gold Coast. I work with the Criminology Institute. When I'm at South Bank, I'm based at the Conservatorium and next to the brass practice section, which is really interesting for your concentration levels. But we have so many different things happening across the university. So it was never going to be a one size fits all. And most organisations will have that. You'll have different teams doing different things. So it's important to identify the uniqueness of how you need to approach that. We need to assess those risks. Now, risk assessment at a kind of organisational level, there are lots of tools that are coming into the market now, which is fantastic for businesses to be able to support them in doing this assessment step. We utilised the People at Work at Griffith. In a previous organisation, utilised the Guarding Minds at Work, which is a Canadian model. But there's also lots of different private models or assessment tools that are coming through the market. And it's about finding something, again, that's going to suit the needs of your organisation and give you the information that's going to be actionable. One of the things that we've really encouraged our people leaders to do is we can get too caught up in risk rating and risk assessment. We want you to move into how are you going to control the risk? Because often people leaders, particularly at a local level, can come and tell me and they say, look, these are our main hazards. This is the main risk area. What do I do? And I'm like, fantastic. Let's move with that. We want to actually do something about it and reduce the risk there rather than get too caught up in, is this low, is this medium, is this high? We want to actually do something to reduce the risk in that space. And that steps us into step 3, which is controlling the risk. I'm going to talk in the next slide about controls, and really interesting in this psychosocial space is that there is such a breadth of different controls and strategies that can reduce risk in these areas. And again, you can get as creative as you want in terms of controlling these risks. It's always great to have conversations with other businesses, other alumni, other organizations, because what I've found in my conversations is everyone has started somewhere slightly different depending on what the priority for their organization has been. And there's a great opportunity to learn from that. I did some work with Logan City Council at a previous pop-up panel event, and we were able to just bounce ideas off of each other because they'd started in a slightly different space to where Griffith was at. And I was able to use some of that to be able to guide what we were going to do next. So having those conversations is so important. And then step 4 is often what I feel is the step we miss sometimes, is that we want to go back and actually review, is what we're doing working? And again, in the psychosocial space, this is a really tricky conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. My goal for 2025 is around assurance, so quality assurance. How am I making sure that what we are training, what we are putting out there as controls, what we're talking about in terms of resourcing and strategies, resources and strategy, is actually working and doing what we think it is. So that's step 4 in going back and making sure that we're closing this circle is vital in this space. When I talk about controls, and again, I think it's an OT thing, but I love a good Venn diagram. But when we talk about controls in this space, you know, I have a really significant lived experience of burnout where I was in a workplace and I was putting out my hand and I was saying, look, I'm not doing well. You know, I'm struggling with my mental health. I'm doing all the self-care things that I would normally do, but I don't feel like I can pick myself up. And unfortunately, my experience in that space was, well, what else are you going to do? You need to be more resilient. You need to find coping, or you need to step away. And the focus was all on those individual strategies or the things that I could do as an individual. Whereas when I reflect and look back on that experience, you know, I was looking after a significant sized team. There was there were huge competing demands on my time. It wasn't easy to prioritize the work that I was doing because everything was being put on my desk as urgent. And there were things that I look back now and I think, well, there were probably organizational or systemic controls that weren't there that would have impacted my experience, and potentially would have created a little bit more longevity and resilience for me in that organization. So when I talk about well-being at work or creating psychosocial safety at work in terms of the strategies and our approach, I talk about finding the balance. So we want those individual level strategies. You know, if individuals aren't looking after themselves and engaging in self-care and taking that and making that a priority, then they're not going to be well at work. But we can't put it all on the individual. And historically, that's where we've sat. So it's really important to acknowledge that at an organization level, we need systems, we need resources, we need time, we need effort on where are these controls coming from, how are we implementing them, how are we making sure when someone walks into our workplace, we're creating that psychosocial safety as best we can. And also acknowledging that at a local level, that needs to be happening as well. There's research that comes out of the States that suggests that outside of someone's friends and family, the next person that has the most impact on their mental health is their direct manager. And that's a lot for people, leaders, to wear on their shoulders, but it's also really important to acknowledge the role that a local level team plays in well-being at work. Because if the organisation has fantastic strategies, really good governance, looking at systems that work from a psychosocial safety perspective, but they're not being applied consistently on the ground at the local level, this balance is going to be out as well. The really interesting conversation also in this space when talk about controls is the hierarchy of controls. If you're a safety professional, you'll know that, probably dreaming about it. If you're not, I would just suggest a Google, but it just suggests that there's a hierarchy of controls in terms of implementation in the safety space. At first, we want to try and eliminate the hazard or eliminate the risk. And then we work our way down to how do we protect the individual at an individual level, whether it be administrative controls, training, or the lowest level of control is PPE. I've heard in the psychosocial space, and I like the comparison, PPE in this space is often our EAP. Something has happened, a person is distressed, and we connect them to EAP. Now, that is so vitally important for that person, but what we want to do is try to make sure we've got controls higher up the hierarchy so that EAP isn't the only thing that's protecting or reducing the risk of harm for that person. And again, we could talk for hours just on controls and what that looks like. But again, just something to get you thinking around how you structure your controls in this space and making sure that we are finding that balance with what we're talking about, what we're implementing. Let's talk about Griffith really quickly for the final kind of 5 minutes or so. Now, when we started this process and did our psychosocial risk assessment and all of those focus groups, these were our key findings. We found that people's understanding of what psychosocial safety and risk management is inconsistent. It was and it still is. Again, 4,000 plus staff members, it takes a long time to build that literacy and that understanding. But what we know, and if there's any speeches in the room, they'll all be really excited that I'm talking about expressive communication. But what we know is that when we can put language to something, often our ability to cope, understand, and express what we need builds. So that literacy piece is really, really important. We found that our risk levels in terms of psychosocial hazards were also inconsistent. And I spoke to that before, given the diversity of work that we do and the differences in where teams are at and the team structures meant that they were experiencing different risk levels for different things and for different reasons. And the root causes of those risks were varied and wide-ranging. Everything, again, from risk of vicarious trauma to, potential occupational violence, working in public-facing settings, to remote work. We have researchers that go literally across the four corners of the globe to do the work that they do. And so the exposure to different hazards and risk levels are very, very varied. We knew really going in and out of the focus groups that people leaders were a vital component of success. Not only does the literature and the research tell us this, but practical feedback, anecdotal feedback, and then, qualitative research from the, feedback from the ground also showed that. We found that through our focus groups, people were talking about a difficulty often finding information about this space. There was barriers to, I don't know where to go. I don't know who to talk to. I don't know where to go to get this information. But we also found on the flip side that there was some amazing things happening. And there were some really great controls implemented in teams across the university. And we really wanted to be able to capture that and provide more consistency and go, hey, this really great thing is working for this team over here. How do we get it implemented in other teams where this is going to work? So those were our key findings, and that really formulated where we started and our plan for this year. Our plan for this year and ongoing beyond this year is to increase capability within our systems, increase capability within our people, and develop and implement accessible resources. So when we build that capability, people have the resources to be able to tap into and run as far as they want and implement controls that are going to work for them so that they're confident and autonomous and feel like they've got ownership over this, which breeds the confidence. So we're looking at systems, things like we have a fantastic safety management system. How do we make sure that people understand that no matter if it's a physical risk or a psychological or psychosocial risk, it follows the same paths, and our systems are responsive to that and have that encapsulated in it, so that teams know how to capture this information, what process they're going to follow, and all of those things. We targeted areas with higher risk scores so we could make sure that in those spaces we were doing the work to decrease that risk. And we're utilising existing referral sources like injuries and complex cases to make sure that we're capturing risks in areas we may not have been aware of. Those accessible resources, we've done things like develop hubs, so central sources of information. We created a control library, so giving people practical examples of things that they might do on the ground within their teams, again, to be able to roll with this autonomously. And in that building capability, people capability piece, we really wanted to focus on people leaders at the starting point. So increasing their understanding of psychosocial risk management, but also increasing their understanding of how they as leaders are also a control and can be a really effective control. Now, one of the interesting things that I've found coming into a university space was we developed an internal training tool, and we wanted it to be a lead indicator. So from a safety perspective, we wanted to be able to say, hand on heart, this control is effective because all of our people leaders across the university have a baseline knowledge of their role in psychosocial risk management and what it is. So we developed an online training tool and training course that was credentialed for our internal stakeholders. And the fascinating thing about a university is I had members of the university approach me and say, hey, I think I've got external stakeholders that would be really, really interested in this. I think this is something that's applicable to all industries. Is there a way that we can make this available externally? So I had the pleasure of developing that and working with the Griffith Professional Learning Hub and also our credentialing team to make that course available externally as well. And there's some information there on it. So what we've tried to do with this training course is create a baseline. So basic understanding around psychosocial risk management, more detail, than what we've run through today, but some of those similar premises, but also build in this component of how do we upskill people leaders in what they can do in the psychosocial risk management space and some of those really practical guides. But also, as I said, acknowledging that people leaders are a really important control for managing psychosocial risk. So our leadership style, our leadership skills, how we apply that is really important to managing psychosocial risk for our team. So there's a component in this course around how those two things interact and overlap and what people leaders can do to improve their effectiveness as a safety control. Now, I've gone 3 minutes over, but hopefully that's kind of a bit of an initial wrap up. As I said, speed dating for psychosocial safety, but hopefully there's some great questions in the chat, and I think Nicole's just going to pop back on and we can get to those questions, but we're going to share these slides as well. So if you're interested in the course or any other questions about the content today, I've included our health and wellbeing email there and also the QR code for the course. If the questions don't cover something that you want to talk about, please reach out. I'm more than happy to have a chat. There's so much to learn from all people in this space. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. And there is definitely a lot of questions coming through. So we'll get started on those and see how many we can get to. The first one we've got here is from Monique, and it is, are there any particular sectors or industries where psychosocial hazards are more prevalent?
It's a really, really interesting question. There's a report that has, so there's a group called Super Friends that produce a wellbeing report that I really love because it breaks some of this down in terms of different industries. I would say that education and training has been on the higher end for a lot of those reports in terms of psychosocial hazards. But what I would say is that, again, it's going to be different for each industry, right, in terms of what hazards you're exposed to and then what the risk from those hazards are. So there's hotspots around, most definitely, but each industry is going to have its own unique challenges and hazards and ways to overcome those.
Okay, thank you. Next one's from Jacob. It's a long one, so let me read it out to you. You mentioned that individual employees may breach the code if they negatively impact the presence of psychosocial hazards in the workplace. This is paraphrased. Does the individual employee then carry the legal risk associated with any hazards they introduce, or does the risk sit with the employer organisation, i.e., due to the organisation's responsibility to mitigate the risk?
That's a fantastic question. And I mean, the answer to that is we're still seeing this play out in case law. There have been a few regulations hand down fines in the psychosocial space. We haven't seen individuals prosecuted at this point in time, but what we have seen is PCBU, so individuals within a PCBU, so that's the business owner or the person conducting a business unit being fined as an individual. So there's lots and lots emerging in this space. The way that the legislation is written is that, yes, it's definitely a possibility that could happen. We just haven't seen it necessarily play out yet.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Melbourne. Are there any standardized assessment or tools for assessing psychosocial risk at work, or is that more context-based or individual specific?
Yeah, so at a broad level, I mentioned some. So People at Work is an Australian risk assessment that was developed based off research that happened in Australia. So that is free to access for all organisations and people. So that's a consistent and specific psychosocial risk assessment. But there are a number of different ones out there that you can access. So yes, you can access a broader external risk assessment to do that piece of the work. You can actually also, depending on the size of your business, do a risk assessment as you would do a safety risk assessment as well. So we operate at Griffith, we've done an organisational level one, but when things pop up or when new work is being undertaken, we do our risk assessments just using the standard kind of risk assessment process for any other safety hazards. So a little bit of both there.
Thank you. The next one is from Daniel. How do you practically assess the effectiveness of interventions or controls you implement to manage psychosocial risks in the workplace once you come back to review your treatments?
That, again, is a fantastic question and one that I'm grappling with at the moment. So, again, it will depend on your controls as to how you measure the effectiveness of those. So, for example, talking about some lead indicators and some controls, where there's training controls, we can definitely measure, how many people have done those, those types of data metrics to show that this control has been implemented. But again, depending on the outcomes of those trainings, you might be measuring different things. So how do we make sure that someone has taken the training and implemented it is a different question altogether. So again, it will depend on your controls that you've got as to how you measure the effectiveness. Some really, not standard, but some really clear data points. Psychological injuries is a clear data point often around, is what we're doing working, or are we seeing an increase in psychological injuries from our organisation, and why might that be? So psychological injuries can be used as a data point for our general controls effective. But again, it will depend on your controls and your outcomes. Employee engagement surveys can be utilised in this space as well. And often what I'm seeing is some of the big providers that roll out those engagement surveys are now doing an overlay with psychosocial hazards. So what questions might pertain to particular hazards. And so again, you could use that data to show, okay, we think that we're controlling for this particular hazard, but our engagement survey data indicates that people are still having an issue with it. So therefore, something is amiss. But when we get to talking about the tricky stuff is, For me, I'm grappling with how do I measure when we're doing this well? So when there's innovation, when there's really great water cooler chat and collaboration, when teams are feeling like they are in the flow and being able to operate at that really high level, how do I measure that? Or what data point can I put on that? So again, ongoing conversation.
Awesome. And this one has been quite popular in the chat. So how can we as employees get managers to ensure our psychosocial safety?
A really, really big one. And I think that comes back to this literacy piece, right? If you as an employee have an understanding of what the obligations are under legislation, you can start to have those conversations around, hey, I would like to, have a conversation with you, my manager, or, senior leadership about what are we doing in this space? Have you conducted a risk assessment? Do you know what hazards are present? How do we have that conversation? And understanding what language you might use to be able to do that. And then also being able to engage and understand, okay, at an individual level, what control or influence can I have as well around my team or my working environment? What are those individual controls or spaces that I can implement? So not necessarily fixing or working to the whole extent of reducing the risk of harm, but what do I have control over? So building literacy and understanding what that conversation might look like or might sound like, and being able to be prepared and confident to have that conversation, but also looking at what can I do at an individual level as well. So really simple ones like, I really encourage people to take lunch. It might seem like a really simple thing, but when we're talking about job demands, when we're talking about self-care, when we're talking about, interactions and relationships, I know that if I'm hangry, I'm not in a good spot. So that's something that might seem seemingly small, but that's a strategy, that's a control, that's just one piece of the puzzle that I can have control over in that space.
Thank you. We're starting to get towards the end, but we'll go, and this one, grooming, gaslighting, and coercive control, are they interactions that fall under psychosocial hazards? If you think, sorry, it's two questions. If you think this is happening to you, what is some advice on how to best manage, as it can be so difficult to prove or explain to others?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely if that's... So those things aren't specifically mentioned in the code of practice, but they would fall for me under the umbrella of potentially poor support, those poor interactions and conflict, and definitely have an impact on someone's psychological health. So, we are talking about, that broad umbrella of hazards and risk of harm here. They can be really tricky, right? So I think, again, first port of call is, as an individual, what am I doing to protect myself as much as I can to make sure that I am okay as I can? So whether that be engaging with counselling or mental health supports, whether that be seeking external advice on what do I do next? This is my situation, what do I do next? So, your first port of call from a clinical perspective is, are you making yourself as safe as possible? The next would be document things, making sure that you're documenting things as much as possible, and then approaching someone in those leadership roles that you feel comfortable and confident talking to, and raising them potentially in the sphere of, hey, I feel like my psychosocial safety is being impacted here. These are the hazards that I think I'm exposed to. And using that language means that, unfortunately, in this space, when we appear emotive, it can also be sometimes put onto the individual, or you're just, reacting or overreacting in this space. But if we can use that language and we put it in a framework that is very much based in objective steps, these are the steps that I want followed, this is what I'm observing. But really, really challenging circumstances if you're an individual facing that in the workplace. And unfortunately, in some instances, it is the case of, do I need to put myself first? And if this environment is too harmful, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel for this being resolved, do I need to move to a different environment?
Okay. And we're dangerously close to time, as we predicted. But there was another really popular one in there around if someone believes they might be approaching burnout, what would be some advice you would give to somebody to do?
Yeah, look, this is really, really tough. And again, from learnt experience, and I say this as someone that didn't follow this advice the first time around, but again, focus on what you need first. You know, and again, that can look for different people, but having an understanding of what, you know, you need and how to manage that, whether that be a self-care component, but also advocating for yourself. Using this language to, you know, if you've tried to have this conversation before and it hasn't worked, using this language to be able to advocate harder in this space and say, these are impacting my psychological health and safety. These things are impacting me because I'm, you know, heading towards burnout, and these are the symptoms of burnout that I have seen. I need change in this space. You know, these are my controls or my strategies that I'm putting forward as solutions. So if it's burnout because there's a high emotional load, you know, I work in case management. I manage psychological injuries. There is a huge, significant emotional load with that. One of my strategies is that I've had conversations with my boss around, this is the max, you know, caseload wise, this is the max, this is the strategy, this is how I'm managing my workload, because anything more than that pushes me into a zone where that stress response is too high. But also there's flexibility in that, and we've got a lot of different strategies. So I would say have an idea of what strategies you think will work for you in your particular context with your particular role, and then be able to use this language to advocate for that. Also, just speaking to some of those, and Nicole, this is probably just the last bit because I know I want to wrap up, but speaking to some of those where there's concerns about not being heard, things not being done, you know, gaslighted, all of these things, burnout and not having a response to that. Know your reporting mechanisms as well. So, you know, you can report to WorkSafe Queensland, which is the regulator for this legislative piece, this legislative instrument. So if you have concerns, if you think there's a business or an organisation in breach, know what reporting mechanisms and options you have for getting support, getting advice, and being able to raise those things if you've tried within your organisation and you don't feel heard. And also acknowledge that if there's an injury sustained at work, there are mechanisms to be able to have, you know, workers' compensation and pathways down there to get support you need. So understanding those support mechanisms and where you could get advice is also really important. So you don't have to do it alone, particularly if you're at that pointy end where you feel like you have experienced or are experiencing psychological harm because of some of these hazards.
Thank you. There's loads more questions in there, but maybe in 30 seconds, so there was one in there around what was something good that you saw happening. So something good in the workplace that maybe is something easy for managers to implement that seems to work well with employees.
Yeah, fantastic. The thing I love the most is what we call ways of working workshops and conversations at a local level. So where managers and teams are getting together and going, as a team, this is the way we want to work together. And that can be a work design piece. So it might be, we're going to have meeting-free Wednesdays and no meetings on Wednesdays. So really down to that granular level to this is how we want to work flexibly. So if we've got meetings that go for more than 3 hours, we want to do them in person because no one wants to stare at a screen for more than 3 hours. So ways of working meetings is one of the things that I have seen have such positive impacts on teams because they create a space of safety so that they feel like they've been heard, they feel like they've created it together, and then they feel like there's practical actions that have come of those conversations. And that means that when hazards pop up into the future, we're seeing those teams more likely to be proactive about them because they feel like they've got a foundation of the way that this team wants to work. So that would be my one that, you know, we've just seen phenomenal outcomes for.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we are going to have to leave it there. So Claire had mentioned there was an online course that you can complete that Claire developed and actually received the highly commended Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Client Partnerships for this training course. So it is very well regarded and really encourage if you've got the time and access to do that. So it should only take you around 4 hours, and I think it's $330 to do that, to enroll, to complete that, and you get certification at the end of it. So encourage you to do that if you can. And as Claire, she listed her contact details there if you want to reach out to her. We'll have the recording available for everyone hopefully by next week. And just to conclude today, I know some people have got to head off, but continuing our 50th anniversary theme, Claire and I both got our backgrounds here. And thank you so much, Claire, for your time today. We've had so much positive feedback coming through there. You've really hit the mark of questions and insights that people were looking for, and validation of maybe what steps to take or what they're seeing currently. So thank you so much for today.